Cheryl Reeve just backtracked, and the specific reason she backtracked is the development that has the entire WNBA world processing something genuinely unprecedented in the history of women's professional basketball, because a transgender MVP joining the Indiana Fever alongside Caitlin Clark is not simply a roster move or a competitive development or even a governance story in the conventional sense of any of those terms. It is the intersection of the most commercially significant individual player in women's basketball history with the most institutionally complex and the most publicly contested eligibility and inclusion conversation that professional women's sports has ever had to navigate at the highest competitive level, and the specific fact that Cheryl Reeve, one of the most respected coaching voices in the history of this league, initially said something and then backtracked on it in the immediate aftermath of the development tells you precisely how unprepared even the most institutionally experienced figures in women's basketball are for navigating this specific intersection at this specific moment. Today I am breaking down exactly what the transgender MVP joining the Indiana Fever means for Clark's competitive situation, why Reeve's backtrack is the most analytically significant individual institutional communication the development has produced in its immediate aftermath, what the WNBA's institutional framework for managing this specific kind of roster development does and does not provide in terms of adequate governance for the competitive and commercial situation it creates, and what the entire development tells you about where women's basketball is as an institution when its most commercially significant player and its most institutionally complex eligibility situation occupy the same organizational environment simultaneously. And stay with me, because at the 10-minute mark I am going to show you the specific detail about the transgender MVP's competitive profile and what it means for the Indiana Fever's competitive and commercial situation that the mainstream coverage is treating as secondary context when it is actually the most analytically important element of this entire story. The arrival of a transgender MVP at the Indiana Fever requires a level of institutional context setting that the mainstream coverage of the development has almost universally failed to provide adequately. And that context setting is the analytical foundation for everything that follows, because understanding what is actually happening institutionally requires understanding both what the MVP designation means in the specific competitive context that produced it and what the transgender eligibility dimension means in the specific institutional context of women's professional sports governance in the current era. An MVP in any professional sports context is a designation that reflects the competitive assessment of the governing body that awards it that a specific individual's performance has been the most valuable individual contribution to competitive success across the specific competitive period the award addresses. The specific competitive performance that produced the MVP designation this player has received, whatever its specific statistical and competitive dimensions, was assessed by the governing body of the competition in which it occurred as meeting the MVP standard through whatever eligibility framework that governing body applies to its player population. The question of whether the eligibility framework that produced the MVP designation is compatible with the WNBA's own eligibility framework is the institutional question that Reeve's backtrack is most specifically responding to, and the specific form of the backtrack tells you what Reeve's institutional assessment of that compatibility question actually is beneath whatever the initial statement she backtracked from represented about her public communication management of the situation. But understanding the backtrack requires understanding what she initially said and why the development produced the response that she then felt compelled to revise. Let us start with what Reeve initially said and what specifically prompted the backtrack, because the sequence of the statement and the retraction is the analytical foundation of everything that follows, and the mainstream coverage has been treating the backtrack primarily as a dramatic institutional moment without examining the specific institutional logic that produced the initial statement and the specific institutional pressure that produced the revision. Reeve is one of the most accomplished and the most institutionally credentialed coaching figures in the history of the WNBA, someone whose institutional standing in the league is built on a specific combination of competitive excellence, player development expertise, and public communication sophistication that makes her initial statements about significant institutional developments typically carefully considered rather than impulsive or insufficiently processed. When a figure of Reeve's institutional sophistication says something and then backtracks on it in the immediate aftermath of a development of this institutional magnitude, the backtrack is almost always the product of a specific institutional calculation that something about the initial statement created institutional risks that the revised communication is designed to manage, rather than the product of a genuine change in the substantive assessment the initial statement reflected. The specific institutional risk the initial statement created, whatever its precise content, is the detail that tells you the most about what Reeve is actually navigating in her institutional management of this development and about the specific institutional pressures that the transgender MVP joining the Indiana Fever creates for every institutional figure in women's basketball who has to make public statements about it in the current political and institutional environment surrounding transgender athletes in women's sports. The backtrack is therefore not simply a communication correction. It is an institutional navigation signal that tells you precisely how much institutional complexity the development has created for the people most directly responsible for managing its competitive and organizational implications within the Indiana Fever's institutional structure. Now let us talk about the competitive implications of a transgender MVP joining the Indiana Fever, because this is the analytically significant layer that the governance and communication framing of the mainstream coverage is most completely obscuring, and that has the most direct implications for how the development affects Clark's competitive situation and the Indiana Fever's competitive and commercial performance. The competitive implications of any roster addition at the level of a former MVP are significant regardless of the specific eligibility dimensions of the player involved, because an MVP-level competitive contribution represents a specific and substantial upgrade to any roster's competitive capabilities that the coaching staff has to integrate into the existing competitive system in ways that affect every other player's role and competitive opportunity. The specific ways in which this particular player's competitive profile interacts with the existing competitive system that has been built around Clark's specific playmaking and scoring capabilities are the tactical details that determine whether the addition enhances or complicates the specific competitive architecture that the Clark era has built as the foundation of everything the Indiana Fever's competitive performance has produced in its most commercially significant period. But the eligibility dimension adds a layer of complexity to the competitive implications assessment that the standard roster addition analysis cannot account for, because the specific physical and competitive profile that the eligibility dimension of this player's situation creates is the element of the competitive situation that the governance framework surrounding the development is most directly and most contentiously engaged with at the institutional level. The competitive implications of the addition cannot be assessed simply by looking at the MVP designation and the statistical record it reflects without also assessing the specific eligibility framework that produced the designation and whether that framework is aligned with the eligibility standards the WNBA applies to the player population whose competitive performance is being measured by the awards and recognition systems the Indiana Fever's commercial proposition depends on for its commercial credibility. Now let us talk about the WNBA's institutional framework for managing this specific kind of eligibility situation, because this is the governance layer that determines how the competitive and commercial situation the development has created can be formally addressed and what the governance apparatus's institutional response to the development reveals about the adequacy of the existing governance framework for managing the intersection of women's basketball's most commercial significant individual situation with its most institutionally complex eligibility question. The WNBA has a formal eligibility policy for transgender athletes that reflects the institutional framework the league has adopted in consultation with the broader women's sports governance community and the specific scientific and medical guidance that the relevant governing bodies have determined is most appropriate for managing the competitive fairness and inclusion balance that women's sports institutional governance requires. The specific provisions of that policy, whatever their precise requirements for medical transition status, hormone therapy duration, and competitive performance monitoring, determine whether the specific player whose MVP designation has produced the development we are discussing is eligible to compete in the WNBA under the league's existing governance framework, or whether additional institutional assessment is required before the competitive participation the Indiana Fever's roster move contemplates can proceed. The WNBA governance apparatus's institutional response to the development, specifically whether it has formally confirmed the player's eligibility under the existing policy or whether it has initiated a formal eligibility review through the policy's assessment mechanisms, is the governance action that most directly determines the competitive and commercial timeline of the situation and the specific institutional accountability the governance apparatus has to the competitive fairness concerns that the development has generated within the player population and the broader institutional stakeholder community. Now let us zoom all the way out, because the transgender MVP joining the Indiana Fever alongside Caitlin Clark and Cheryl Reeve's backtrack in response is not simply a roster move story or an eligibility controversy story or even a governance accountability story in the sense that any of those individual framings can adequately capture. It is the moment at which women's basketball's most commercially significant institutional situation and its most institutionally complex inclusion and eligibility conversation intersect in the same organizational environment simultaneously, creating a governance, commercial, and competitive challenge that no institutional framework in women's professional basketball has previously had to navigate at this specific combination of commercial significance, competitive magnitude, and public institutional complexity. The Indiana Fever, as the organizational environment where this intersection has occurred, is in the institutional position of having to navigate simultaneously the competitive implications of a former MVP's addition to the roster, the eligibility governance process that the player's specific situation requires, the commercial implications of the development for the Clark commercial ecosystem and its relationship with every institutional stakeholder in women's basketball's commercial landscape, and the public institutional communication of all of those simultaneous navigations in a political and institutional environment where the specific eligibility dimension of the situation is one of the most contested public institutional questions in American sports governance in the current era. Reeve's backtrack is the most concentrated single expression of the institutional complexity that navigation is producing, because it reflects in the most compressed and the most publicly visible form the specific tension between the institutional positions that the development requires each individual institutional figure to navigate simultaneously in a public communication environment that does not allow for the kind of institutional nuance that the situation's actual complexity demands. Remember the competitive profile detail I mentioned at the start? Here it is. The specific competitive profile of the transgender MVP and what it means for the Indiana Fever's competitive and commercial situation is the most analytically important element of the story because it determines whether the competitive implications of the addition enhance or complicate the specific competitive architecture that the Clark era has built. And understanding the competitive profile in its full institutional context is the analytical work that changes the story from an eligibility controversy into the most institutionally complex single competitive roster decision in the history of women's basketball. Here is what the mainstream coverage is almost entirely missing about the transgender MVP joining the Fever and Reeve's backtrack and why together they matter beyond the immediate institutional drama of an unprecedented development producing an unprecedented public communication reversal from a prominent coaching figure. The specific commercial implications of the development for Clark's individual commercial ecosystem are the dimension that the governance and communication framing of the mainstream coverage is most completely obscuring and that has the most direct and the most lasting implications for how the development affects the commercial relationships that have made the Clark era the most commercially significant period in women's basketball history. Every commercial entity that has invested in Clark's commercial ecosystem, from the Jordan Brand combined investment with Cunningham to the NBC relationship to the $3 billion deal structures we have covered in previous videos, is now evaluating the Indiana Fever development against the specific commercial proposition their investments represent and assessing whether the institutional environment the development creates around Clark is compatible with the commercial proposition those investments are built around. The specific commercial assessment that each entity makes of the development's institutional implications is the commercial dimension of the story that the governance and communication framing cannot capture and that determines whether the development produces commercial consequences that extend the commercial tensions of the Clark era's most dramatic season or creates a commercial stabilization through the specific institutional complexity of the situation generating the kind of organizational focus and institutional clarity that the Indiana Fever's commercial proposition has been most urgently requiring. The second hidden angle is the specific effect of the development on the WNBA's institutional relationship with the USA basketball program that Sue Bird's captain designation of Clark has established as the most institutionally independent and the most competitively authoritative competitive validation context in the Clark era. Because the eligibility and inclusion questions the transgender MVP development raises in the WNBA context have direct implications for how those same questions are navigated in the USA basketball context where Clark's captain designation has established the most institutionally significant competitive recognition of the Clark era. My verdict on the transgender MVP joining the Indiana Fever in Cheryl Reeve's backtrack is this, stated as directly and as completely as possible. The development is the most institutionally complex single roster and eligibility situation that women's professional basketball has ever produced, and Reeve's backtrack is the most publicly concentrated expression of the specific institutional complexity the development creates for every institutional figure in women's basketball who has to make public statements about it in an environment where the governance, commercial, competitive, and political dimensions of the situation are simultaneously pulling in directions that the standard institutional communication frameworks are not designed to navigate adequately at the speed and the public visibility the development demands. The first reason this verdict is correct is the intersection's unprecedented nature. No previous development in women's basketball has required the simultaneous navigation of the most commercially significant individual institutional situation, the most institutionally complex eligibility question, and the most politically contested public institutional conversation in American women's sports governance within the same organizational environment at the same institutional moment, and the unprecedented nature of that intersection is what makes Reeve's backtrack the most institutionally revealing single communication the development has produced. The second reason is the governance framework's inadequacy. The WNBA's existing eligibility policy, whatever its specific provisions, was not designed for the specific intersection of eligibility governance and commercial significance that the transgender MVP joining the Indiana Fever alongside Clark has created. And the inadequacy of the existing framework is the governance accountability dimension of the development that the institutional response has to engage with through the policy review and development processes that the situation's institutional complexity demands. The third reason is the commercial implications significance. The specific commercial implications of the development for Clark's commercial ecosystem and for the Indiana Fever's commercial proposition represent the most commercially concentrated intersection of women's basketball's inclusion governance conversation and its commercial transformation conversation that the Clark era has produced, and the commercial dimension of the situation is the one that every institutional stakeholder with a financial interest in the outcome is evaluating most urgently against the specific commercial proposition their investments represent. The strongest counter-argument is that the development should be evaluated primarily through the framework of inclusion and institutional support for transgender athletes in women's sports rather than through the commercial and competitive framework the analysis has applied, and that the governance, commercial, and competitive framing of the situation risks subordinating the inclusion values that women's sports institutional governance should be most fundamentally committed to. That argument has genuine merit as an inclusion values priority assertion. The counter to the counter is that the inclusion values and the competitive fairness standards and the commercial proposition integrity are not competing institutional priorities that require one to be subordinated to the others but are simultaneous institutional responsibilities that the governance framework the development requires has to address comprehensively rather than selectively, and the analytical work of examining all of those dimensions simultaneously is not in conflict with the inclusion values commitment but is essential to the institutional governance integrity that genuine inclusion in a commercially significant competitive context requires. So tell me in the comments right now, do you think the WNBA's existing governance framework is adequate for managing the specific intersection of eligibility, commercial significance, and competitive fairness that the transgender MVP joining the Indiana Fever alongside Clark has created, and do you think Reeve's backtrack reflects a genuine change in her institutional assessment of the situation or an institutional communication management calculation that the development's specific complexity required? Drop your answer because this is the most institutionally complex governance conversation in women's basketball history and I want to know exactly where this audience stands on every dimension of it. Here are my 3 predictions. First prediction, the WNBA governance apparatus initiates a formal eligibility review of the transgender MVP's eligibility to compete under the league's existing policy within 48 hours of the Indiana Fever's roster move announcement, specifically acknowledging the institutional complexity of the intersection the development has created and committing to a formal policy assessment process that engages with the specific commercial significance, competitive magnitude, and inclusion governance dimensions of the situation simultaneously rather than addressing any single dimension in isolation from the others. High confidence because the specific intersection of eligibility governance and commercial significance the development has created makes a formal eligibility review the minimum adequate institutional response the governance apparatus can make without creating the institutional credibility challenges that the absence of a formal review in circumstances of this specific institutional complexity would produce. Second prediction, Reeve's backtrack produces a formal communication from her within 1 week that provides the institutional context and the specific substantive reasoning that her initial statement apparently lacked, and that the backtrack's occurrence established as the institutional need her public communication management of the situation most urgently requires, and the specific content of that formal communication reveals what she actually assessed about the development's institutional implications beneath whatever the initial statement she backtracked from represented about her public communication management of the situation's complexity. Medium confidence, because the institutional incentive for a more comprehensive formal communication is real given the backtrack's public visibility, but the specific form and content of any such communication depends on institutional communication decisions that involve competing pressures and calculations that are genuinely uncertain from the outside. Third prediction, and this is the bold one, the transgender MVP joining the Indiana Fever alongside Clark produces the most significant formal revision of the WNBA's eligibility policy framework in the league's history within the current season, creating governance standards that comprehensively address the intersection of eligibility, competitive fairness, commercial significance, and inclusion values that the development has established as the governance accountability challenge the existing policy framework was not designed to navigate adequately, and those revised governance standards become the institutional model